Kia ora. This presentation is to support topic 3, activity 3, looking at sustainability literacy. It is an explanation of some information that's also presented in a text, and it comes from a researcher in education for sustainability literature called Capra. So we're just going to take a little bit of time to go through the ideas that he suggests we might need to look for if we are wanting to support or better understand what sorts of functional literacies we would be wanting to develop in learners related to sustainability. One of the underpinning concepts of sustainability is the web of life. This is related to an understanding that everything is interconnected, which is present there in the little visual with the web showing how things are connected. And when I say everything, I mean everything. So we're talking about the plants, the animals, the microorganisms, the animate, the inanimate, water, atmosphere, all of it. It's what all life depends on. So an important idea or concept to get your head around is this idea that even though there's a whole lot of stuff that we never probably think much about, it is interconnected to this unique web of life that we have on planet Earth, where things interact and enable a balance of life that is able to be sustained. So hence this little quote at the bottom by John Muir, when one tugs at a single thing in nature, he finds it is attached to the rest of the world. And that's an important idea that we're going to continue to think about as we go through this presentation. So we recognise this image. It's one that's been, I guess, portrayed often about this unique beauty of the earth as taken from space. And so we see that and we recognise that as earth, but somehow we often seem to forget that we are part of that whole sphere of life that you see in front of you. We often seem to take this view that we are out here in space and we can look back and not see ourselves as participants in that globe. So coming back to the idea of our web, we need to really bring to the forefront of our thinking that idea that we are as much a part of that web of life as all those other things that I talked about previously. The birds, the plants, the soil, all the things that live in the soil, all the things that live in the water, all the things that live in the air, all of the things that are around us. And so it's really important to make sure that we think about it as ourselves as being part of that whole system. So we're not onlookers from space. We're not separate from everything else. We live, we breathe, and we thrive in conjunction with all of those other parts of life that are on planet Earth. Understanding that we are part of this dynamic and amazing system is vital for the idea of working within sustainability literacy. So according to Capra, this dynamic system has an inherent ability to sustain life. What does he mean by this? He talks about relationships being the core of life on Earth. He notes that relationships between all of Earth's inhabitants have continued to develop, adapt and change over enormous amounts of time. These cycles have seen many changes and developments. People, like all other parts of this dynamic system, need to work out how to be part of communities that cooperate and learn from these processes developed over time, as they are good models for us to learn from. So So when we look at communities where we live and work in life, Capra talks about that the need for sustainable communities as being ones where life in all its facets, so if we think about everything that encompasses the world of people in terms of our workplaces, our places of play, our places of recreation, the things that drive economies, so our businesses, our rural and our urban landscapes, the places that we go to learn, our organisation, where we go to recreate. He talks about all these places as needing to be working in ways that cooperate with nature and its ability, that inherent ability that we talked about in the last slide, to support all life. And when we think about that, we think about all of the things that we do and need to do to survive and live and thrive. We need to also, though, be mindful of the other parts of planet Earth that interact with those decisions that we make, from the very small. So looking and thinking, whose perspective might this particular picture be taken from? Of course, through to the very big. And so here's a lovely example of how we have learned from what we can see around us, and how we are learning to harness and use that in ways that do cooperate with our natural systems. So one of the other things that Capra talks about in terms of sustainability literacy, and the things that we need to be reminded of, is this notion again around that web of life. And because when we had the quote earlier from John Muir, where when we tug on one thing, we find that it is connected to something else, that gives us this particular notion of feedback loops. So our thriving, sustainable community is responsive. So because when we tug on one part of the web, it has a reaction somewhere else in the web, we're able to get feedback from this and learn from it. So this is why he says that things within the system are responsive. If the relationship between the tug and the tugger works, it will continue. So that's how he describes sustainability. If the relationship is not successful, we can learn from this and adapt and change so that life is sustained. And again, a reminder, when we say that word life, we're thinking about life in all the facets that it takes place on Earth. So Capra calls this learning from our mistakes. And he says that a living community is a learning community. When we think about this in our contexts, how do we perhaps incorporate this idea of sustainability literacy into our programs? Another benefit that Capra talks about in terms of this responsive nature of life on Earth is that sometimes mistakes can lead to further improvements and change and adaptation that supports a thriving life for all. And he says that this is a feature of a dynamic system. So just as feedback loops and recognising consequences of actions is important, in sustainability literacy, learning from these opportunities is a feature of living communities. Look closely and you will see a gecko in the picture. Further aspect that Capra talks about in our dynamic living community is this idea around knowledge versus knowing. So Capra says that knowing happens through the experience of doing something in its context and finding out how the feedback loops respond. So rather than being teachers who transmit things we think learners need to know, in a dynamic system, in a learning community, we support learning to happen in authentic, real situations, in their settings or in their communities. Looking at this image, we might know or recognise that these are paddy fields from some time in our life. But do we know how to form these? Do we know how to plant them? Do we know how to harvest from them? So this idea around knowing, and for our learners to be knowing, is a really important aspect. So if you think about knowledge versus knowing in your teaching or in your programs, what does knowing look like? How do you engage learners in knowing? There's lots to see in this slide in terms of the forms, the different forms of life that are part of the dynamic systems that make a sustainable community. So just as we have diversity in the plants, animals, microorganisms, of course there is diversity in people as well. So the ability to respond to change sustains life, according to Capra. Diversity within a community enables a variety of responses to be tried and tested. Being able to draw on many and different ideas is a strength in sustaining a great quality of life. So finally, Capra talks about leadership as being one of the core ideas of sustainability literacy to enable these learning, thriving communities that he thinks is important. So leadership within a diverse community will enable those new ideas, those innovations to rise and enable us to really understand how we can work in good relationships with the other parts of the planet in which we inhabit. So he is thinking about the tools and the structures and the ways of doing things, the approaches that we take to solving problems and working together as being really important parts of sustainability literacy. So it encourages learning cultures that go about doing continual questioning and creating conditions for learning to happen rather than for giving direction. It was that idea that we talked about previously with the contrast between knowing and knowledge. So creating networks for communication where there is mutual support and trust, that there's passion, that there's celebration for things that work and sometimes celebration of the things that don't work. And that's that previous slide about recognising that making mistakes is valued and learning from that is also celebrated. So this last picture here just shows again how we can learn from things that have already, the systems and the processes that have already been developed in nature. So you'll see there on the right hand side a picture of some Velcro, and that came from this idea in nature called biomimicry, where there is the little prickly thistles, and by observing and seeing that happening in nature, you could see that things caught and stuck, and so that's a really good example of how we can innovate and create, and it is the leadership that Capra talks about that enables those things to happen that is really vital and important to sustainability literacy. This presentation has just given you some time to think about what sustainability literacy is. It's presented from Capra's view, and so now it's really important that you have some time to think about what you think of these ideas. So for example, have you thought about yourself as being part of the systems of Earth before? What does that look like for you? How do you see yourself as being an active member of a dynamic and evolving system? And what role do we have in being part of a bigger whole? And then I guess as you look down the slide, there's some questions there that relate to the skilled practitioner framework in terms of thinking about how this might be part of the teaching and learning program that you undertake. So in order to complete the activity on the School Practitioner Framework, it's about you being able to pick up the ideas from here that seem at the moment to be relevant and appropriate for your context. The last bullet points on the slide are summarising some of those key attributes or ideas that Capra suggests are really important for developing sustainability literacy in and with people to enable these dynamic living, learning communities that he believes will sustain all life. Ka kite, all the best with embedding sustainability literacy in your practice.